My name is Nathan Langford. I'm 38 years old. I've spent most of my adult life working in corporate strategy, quietly behind the scenes, helping some of the biggest names in the business world avoid disaster and grow quietly rich. I'm not the kind of man who talks much about who he is or what he owns. I believe power is best held in silence, which is why when I walked into that engagement party, I didn't correct him. I let him call me her weird cousin. You see, the man introducing me like I was some socially awkward tag-along was my sister's fiancé, a polished guy with too much gel in his hair, and a grin that was more for mirrors than people. He didn't know me. Not really, but he knew what he thought I looked like, plain unimpressive, the kind of man you dismiss quickly and forget even faster. So when he gestured lazily toward me and said, "That's Emily's weird cousin. He just kinda does tech or something," I smiled. I said nothing, but his father heard my last name, and that changed everything. The man dropped his glass, mid-sip. You could hear the crystal hit the hardwood. His face went pale like he'd seen a ghost, dressed in a suit. The whole room, once buzzing with laughter and champagne, fell dead quiet. All eyes shifted from the spilled drink to me. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply offered a polite nod and said, "Langford, Nathan Langford," and it was as if a curtain dropped over the evening, because they all knew the name, but hadn't connected it to me. See, Langford isn't just a name, it's a legacy. My grandfather founded one of the largest private equity firms on the East Coast. My father expanded it globally, and me, I made it untouchable, discreet, powerful, terrifying to those in the know. But I never advertised it, especially not to people like him. My sister had no idea who I really was. She knew I worked in finance, sure, but I'd kept the scale and reach of my work to myself. I liked it that way, until this moment. That night, everything changed, not because I was offended, but because I saw something. A man who thought he had climbed far enough to disrespect the quiet ones. A man who saw people as props, who treated my sister like an accessory and me like a footnote. But I didn't react. I didn't defend myself. I just watched. I stored it all. And what he didn't know was that introductions don't define people, bloodlines and choices do, and I was about to make one. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who they were talking to, comment below, they'll find out soon enough. I stayed at that party longer than I needed to. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to see how deep his performance went. My sister, Emily, was glowing. She was too in love to notice the subtle slights, the dismissive tone he used when she spoke, or how often he turned conversations back to himself. I watched quietly. I listened. The more I observed, the more I realized this wasn't just about one rude comment. It was a pattern, a sickness, the kind of ego that grows like mold when no one confronts it. Growing up, Emily was the one person in my family who never treated me like an obligation. I was the quiet child, always in books, always calculating. She brought me snacks when I forgot to eat. She taught me to dance before prom because I was too stiff to try. She deserved the world, and instead she was engaged to a man who couldn't recognize the treasure in front of him. But I wouldn't lecture her. I wouldn't burst her bubble with warnings she wasn't ready to hear. I would wait, because people like him always reveal themselves. Later that night, I slipped away to the balcony, needing air. That's when his father approached me. "Langford," he said again, as if trying the name on his tongue. "Any relation to Samuel Langford?" I nodded. He was my grandfather. The man's face stiffened. I knew him. He once shut down a deal I'd worked on for 2 years. Cost me millions. I gave him a polite smile. He had a sharp sense for risk. He didn't respond, just nodded once and walked away like he'd seen a ghost. and maybe he had, just not the dead kind. From that moment on, the mood shifted. Suddenly, the people who'd barely acknowledged me now wanted to talk. I heard my name whispered across tables. His father kept glancing at me like a man who'd missed a very dangerous memo. But the fiancé? He remained clueless, too self-impressed to notice the ground shifting beneath him, too arrogant to realize the man he mocked was the very storm he should have been running from. That's when I made the decision. I wouldn't just correct him. I would teach him, quietly, precisely, permanently. What most people don't understand is this. Revenge doesn't come in fire, not when it's real. It comes in silence, in careful, calculated steps that dismantle the illusion brick by brick. I didn't want to humiliate him in public. That would have made him the victim. No, I wanted him to undo himself, to feel the slow unraveling of control, to question everything he thought he owned. And to do that, I needed leverage. Not rumors, not drama, proof. And so began the quiet phase. Not of anger, but of clarity. I would protect my sister, but I would do it without yelling, without warnings, and without letting him know he'd already lost. The thing about men like him, they always leave a trail. Arrogance makes them sloppy. They assume no one's watching, and even if someone is, they think they're too clever to be caught. That's where they make their first mistake. I started simple, a background sweep, not just on him, but on his circle, business partners, real estate ventures, shell LLCs. It didn't take long. One of the first things I found was a property registered under a firm that didn't exist 3 years ago, yet had funding connections to an offshore account, flagged in 2 prior investigations. Interesting. I didn't take it to my sister. That's not how this works. She wasn't ready to hear it. Love makes people blind, and I wasn't about to play the villain in her perfect story, so I dug deeper. Carefully, methodically, I reached out to a contact at a financial oversight firm. Someone who owed me a favor from a decade ago. Within days I had transaction histories, indirect connections, and more than enough red flags to raise the hair on any regulator's neck. But I wasn't after jail time. I was after exposure and disintegration. Then came the conversation with his former business partner, a coffee meeting under a pseudonym in a quiet cafe near Midtown. The man looked tired, worn out by years of trying to warn others. He always had charm, he said. But it's a mask. Everything he touches, he uses. Once he gets what he wants, he's gone. And you're left to clean up the wreckage. He showed me documents, old legal drafts, NDA breaches, and one email in particular where he joked about marrying into money through a naive, upper-tier girl. It was dated 4 months before he even met Emily. I didn't react. I simply saved the file and thanked him for his time. No threats, no drama. I walked out of that cafe with everything I needed to begin phase 2. He thought he was marrying into a soft family with no bite. He had no idea who he was dealing with. My name had once been the reason mergers didn't go through. I had whispered advice that made billionaires hesitate, and yet he had treated me like a ghost in the room. That was fine. I would haunt him in silence. The next step wasn't confrontation. It was positioning. I reached out to a few influential voices in the financial press. Not to publish anything yet, but to stir questions, to raise interest. I hinted at a coming scandal involving misuse of marital leverage to shield assets. I dropped names, not his, but those around him. Enough to make the ripples reach his ears. Because sometimes the best way to expose a liar is to make them speak first. And I knew he would. And all the while, I kept visiting Emily. We talked about wedding plans, venues, flowers. I smiled. I supported. And I let her believe I was just the quiet cousin who got lucky in finance. But deep inside, I was building the fall. quietly, one keystroke at a time. It didn't take long for the pressure to start working. I noticed the signs within a week. He began asking Emily strange questions about our family's assets, about who was managing the estate since our parents passed. He played it off like casual curiosity, but I knew what he was really doing. He was looking for cracks, looking for leverage, but that only made me more certain. He had no idea the foundation he was walking on was iron, not glass. Every word he said, I remembered. Every suspicion he showed, I marked. Then came the business call. He didn't know I was the majority stakeholder in the holding company bidding for a major tech contract he'd been bragging about for months. His firm had been desperate to land it. It would have launched him into a league he wasn't built for. I watched from the other side of the table, under a different name, in a virtual meeting. He pitched with the same smug charm he used at the party, assuming he was talking to nobodies. I didn't say a word. I just watched as his numbers fell apart under basic scrutiny. After the call, I made one quiet decision: disqualify him. Not publicly, just enough for the client to lose interest. I sent a private brief to the board, filled with the documentation I'd gathered: financial irregularities, partnership instability, asset misdirection. It wasn't revenge, it was risk mitigation. And within 48 hours his contract was delayed indefinitely. I knew he'd feel it. He'd probably scream behind closed doors, throw something, curse the air, but I wasn't there to see it. I didn't need to be. His unraveling had begun. Back at home, Emily mentioned something that confirmed everything. "He's been acting weird lately," she said over tea. "Jumpy, almost paranoid." I kept my tone even. "He's probably stressed. The wedding's coming up." She nodded. She didn't suspect anything, but she also started to ask more questions. Subtle ones, about how to set up a trust, about how to separate assets in a prenup. I gave her answers without pushing. She wasn't ready to know what I knew, but I could see the threads in her mind beginning to pull. He must have sensed it too. That's when the charm started to crack. He began criticizing her ideas more sharply, mocking her preferences, turning simple moments into power plays. And through it all I remained the silent cousin, the man in the background, never confronting, never accusing, just watching. Because the truth is, some people don't need to be pushed. They crumble all on their own when the mirror finally shows them who they are. By the end of that month, his eyes were no longer full of confidence. They were full of fear, and he didn't even know who he was afraid of yet. The night everything collapsed didn't start with drama. It started with a dinner, a quiet one, hosted by his parents at their estate. Emily invited me. She said it would mean a lot to her if I came, and I said yes. I knew this was the end game. He didn't know it yet. But that night would be the last time he sat comfortably at the head of anything. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of respect for him, but for the moment itself. I wanted to feel the silence before the storm. They introduced me again. This time, no one called me the weird cousin. This time, they used my full name, with care, with a hush. I saw the tremor in his father's hand as he passed me a glass. I watched the flicker in his mother's eyes when she mentioned my grandfather's legacy. The entire room had shifted. I was no longer invisible. I was the quiet force they should have acknowledged from the start. And now, they were realizing too late that I had always been listening. But the real crack came mid-meal. His father asked him casually about a recent loss of interest from a major client. I kept my eyes on my plate. He fumbled, said something vague about internal reshuffling. Then another guest chimed in about rumors, something about asset misdirection in a startup deal. And just like that, the walls started closing in. He turned pale. His voice got sharper. His charm dissolved into excuses. He looked around the table like a drowning man searching for dry land, but no one reached for him. Emily didn't speak for a long time, but when she did, it was with a voice I hadn't heard from her before. Calm, steady. "Is there anything I should know before we get married?" she asked him. He stared at her like a stranger. I watched his lips part, then close again. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't crying. She was just awake. And he realized too late that whatever spell he'd cast was broken. My sister was looking at him through new eyes, eyes I had quietly helped open. He tried to recover. He tried the old tricks, humor, charm, deflection. But they fell flat in a room that no longer believed him. His father stood up halfway through dessert and never came back. His mother said she had a headache and disappeared into the hallway. And Emily? She quietly stood, placed her napkin on the table and said, "I'll get my things from your apartment tomorrow." No tears, no fight, just quiet exit. The kind that tells you it's truly over. I followed her out. Didn't say much, just walked beside her. She looked at me, a single tear catching the moonlight, and said, "You didn't have to say anything. You just let the truth speak." I nodded, because sometimes justice doesn't need a gavel or a stage. It just needs patience. The days that followed were quiet. Not for him, I'm sure, but for me and Emily, it was the silence of peace returning. She moved into my guest house while figuring out her next step. I gave her space, didn't pry. I knew she needed to sit with the truth, not be talked through it. Some lessons hurt more than betrayal itself. The lesson of trust misplaced, of time given to someone who only saw value in appearances. I checked on her one evening, left a plate of food by her door like we used to do for each other as kids. She opened it and smiled, faint but real. "Thank you," she whispered. That was all, and it meant everything. I didn't need her to thank me for what I'd done. I only wanted her to come back to herself. And slowly, she was. Every morning she stood taller. Every night she asked fewer questions about him. That's when I knew the healing had begun. But I wasn't finished. Not quite. See, the collapse wasn't about a broken engagement. That was only the surface. I wanted to make sure his foundation never rebuilt on lies again. So I moved quietly behind the scenes. My firm began purchasing small stakes in his remaining ventures, not enough to alarm him, but enough to influence direction. And when the time came, I pulled 2 strategic investors from a startup he was courting. No public scandal, just quiet withdrawal, a door softly closing. One of his junior partners reached out to me, curious why the funding vanished. I didn't lie. I told him some men don't build. They harvest, and eventually they run out of other people's fields. The young man nodded, realizing he'd been planting seeds in the wrong soil. A week later, he left the company. Another one followed. Slowly, the structure weakened, not with a crash, but with a sigh, and the man who had once laughed too loudly in rooms that weren't his began to sit alone. I thought of confronting him, just once, looking him in the eye and telling him what I'd done. But what purpose would it serve? He'd already lost the thing he couldn't buy back, reputation that lives in silence, in who won't return your calls, in doors that no longer open. Not because of enemies, but because of who you revealed yourself to be, and that is the quietest destruction of all. So, I stayed in the background, just as I'd begun, because some stories aren't about proving yourself. They're about protecting what matters and watching the rest collapse by its own weight. Months passed. The city moved on, but he didn't. I'd hear whispers through mutual contacts, how his firm was struggling to close deals, how his charm had worn thin, and how investors were beginning to question his leadership. The narrative had shifted. He was no longer the rising star. He was a liability, a name spoken in caution. not in celebration. And the irony. I never had to raise my voice, just kept showing up in the right places, as a shadow he couldn't outrun. Emily started to glow again. She'd enrolled in a design program, something she'd shelved years ago to make room for his ambitions. I walked past her sketchpad one day and saw wedding gown concepts, not for herself, for clients. She looked up shyly. "I think I want to start something," she said. I nodded. "Then start." There was no applause, no dramatic breakthrough, just the quiet reawakening of someone reclaiming her name, her talent, her life. I funded her business anonymously, registered the LLC under a third-party agent, sent the initial seed through an angel fund she didn't know I controlled, because this wasn't about being owed. It was about giving her a fresh beginning with no shadows attached to mine. She named the studio Sparrow and Ivy, a name we used in childhood games, back when we pretended to design magical dresses for invisible royalty. Some stories do circle back home. He sent her an email one evening. Short, cold, a mix of guilt, regret, and shallow excuses. He didn't ask for her back. He didn't dare, but he did try to rewrite the past. "Things just got complicated," he said. She forwarded it to me. I didn't say a word, just watched her delete it without replying. That was her closure. She didn't need mine. But I knew he wasn't done. Men like him never leave a table willingly. They just wait for another invitation. So I made sure none came. I reached out to a major media contact who was working on a profile of rising stars in private capital. His name was on the list. I quietly provided files, not slander, just facts. Verified, time-stamped, traceable. The article never ran. The list was revised. His name was gone. And in his absence, no one asked why. Winter came, and with it a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. My work remained steady. My projects expanded, but something inside me had quieted, not out of fatigue, but from resolution. I had done what needed to be done, not out of vengeance, but protection. And now I could exhale. Sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones no one else sees, the ones you carry privately, knowing a storm was avoided, a soul preserved. Emily's studio began to gain traction. She designed a dress for a local celebrity's gala appearance, and suddenly the calls poured in. She hired 2 assistants, opened a small showroom. Her laugh returned unforced, radiant, the kind that made people turn their heads. Watching her thrive reminded me why I stayed quiet for so long. I never needed recognition, I needed results. And here they were, wrapped in fabric, stitched with grace. One morning, I received a letter. Handwritten, no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. It wasn't angry, it wasn't even bitter. It was hollow. He wrote that he understood now who I was, that he regretted making assumptions, that things could have been different. I folded it once and placed it in a drawer. I didn't burn it, I didn't frame it, I just left it there. A reminder, not of pain but of how misjudgment looks when it finally runs out of fuel. A colleague asked me to speak at a leadership summit. The topic was legacy over ego. I almost laughed at the timing. I accepted. I spoke not about wealth or power or winning, but about the value of stillness, of resisting the need to be loud when the truth is already working. I didn't mention names, but I told the room, some of the most permanent victories are earned in silence. Let fools exhaust themselves trying to be seen. We build legacies by seeing what others overlook. After the event, a young entrepreneur approached me and said, "You spoke like someone who's lived through betrayal and didn't let it define him." I smiled, not because he was right, but because I had finally reached a point where it no longer defined me either. I'd carried the weight long enough. It had served its purpose. Now, I could let it go. And letting go, I've learned, is not weakness. It's a final, sacred act of power. It's strange how time changes the shape of a memory. What once felt sharp now feels distant. Not dull, but refined, like a scar that no longer stings, only reminds you of what you've survived. I don't think about him much anymore, not out of avoidance, but because the space he used to take up in my mind is now filled with better things, quiet mornings. Emily's success, the slow, honest rhythm of a life I rebuilt without ever needing applause. Every now and then, I hear about him, second-hand, accidental, a friend of a friend mentioning his name in passing. I nod, say nothing, and move on. Apparently, he's moved out of the city, tried to rebrand himself elsewhere, new company, new haircut. But it never lasts, because you can change your scenery all you want. But if you never confront your character, you'll just recreate the same collapse in new soil. And men like him never do the inner work. They just keep dressing up the rot. One evening, Emily and I had dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown, just the two of us. No clients, no noise. She wore a dress she'd made herself, deep blue silk with quiet embroidery near the hem. As we ate, she said something that stayed with me. You know, if you had told me what you were doing, I would have tried to stop you. I smiled. That's exactly why I didn't. She laughed, soft and full. Thank you, she whispered, for choosing silence when I needed space. There's a power in not being the loudest, in not rushing to be understood. The world teaches us to fight with noise. But the most dangerous men are the ones who wait, who watch, who act only when the time is right. I learned that from my grandfather, and I never forgot it. Every step I took in this story was guided by that principle. Don't swing if the fall will happen on its own. Just make sure the ground is ready to catch them when it does. The man who once introduced me as her weird cousin will never understand the weight of the room that night. Not really, but his father does. And the business world does. And, most importantly, she does. That's all I ever wanted. Not revenge, just recognition of who I am, what I stand for, and the lengths I'll go to protect the people I love. And in that quiet truth, I found something even more valuable than justice. I found peace. Peace, I've discovered, isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand applause. It slips in quietly, like sunlight through an open window. One morning you simply realize you're no longer carrying the weight. You're not checking your rearview mirror for ghosts. You're not bracing for the next betrayal. You're just here, breathing, living, free. That's what the end of this story became for me. A quiet life restored, not because I fought harder, but because I let silence speak louder than revenge. Emily's business flourished. She landed a national bridal campaign. Her work featured in magazines, worn by women who'd never heard of her past, but could feel the beauty born from it. Watching her rise without ever needing to explain what she escaped was the most rewarding part of it all. She no longer spoke of him, not out of denial, but because some chapters deserved to be closed without rereading every line. She was building, not remembering, and I was proud to stand behind her. I bought a cabin outside the city, small, surrounded by pines, no signal, no meetings, just stillness. I go there once a month to reset, to remember that the world doesn't need to know your name for you to make an impact. The loudest men burn out, the consistent ones endure. That's the rule I live by. That's the legacy I inherited, and that's the one I'll pass on, if not in name, then in quiet influence. Sometimes I walk by the drawer where his letter still rests. I never reread it. I never needed to. It's a sealed chapter, untouched. Not because I'm above it, but because I outgrew it. He built his life on illusion. I built mine on foundation, and now every win that comes to me, to Emily, to the people we care about, it all comes with that unspoken satisfaction. We earned this the right way. No shortcuts, no schemes, just grace, patience, and precise power. There's a particular kind of silence that only comes once everything is behind you. It's not empty, it's not lonely, it's sacred. I sat in that silence one evening, alone at the cabin, with a fire cracking and no phone in sight, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I wasn't just proud of how I handled it. I was proud of who I became because of it. Not bitter, not vengeful, just still, just clear. That's redemption, not for them, but for yourself. Emily came up to visit a few weeks later. We drank tea on the porch and watched the fog roll through the trees. She told me she'd met someone new, said his name quietly, as if it might break the spell, but her eyes sparkled, not with hope alone, but with discernment. She was no longer falling in love to be rescued. She was choosing to build with someone who saw her clearly. That's when I knew she had healed, and that I could finally exhale the last of what I had carried. The man who tried to reduce me to a title, her weird cousin, will likely never face a courtroom or a scandal. There will be no headlines, no public downfall, but he will wake up every morning knowing the doors that closed on him will never reopen. Not because someone slammed them shut, but because someone quietly made sure he never found the key. That is how real consequence moves. Not in chaos, but in architecture. Looking back, I don't regret a single quiet decision. I never shouted. I never warned. I simply observed, protected, and waited. And when the time came, I acted, not out of rage, but out of love. Love for my sister. Love for our name. Love for the kind of dignity that doesn't need to be defended. It simply exists. And in the end, that love did more than any speech ever could. It preserved what mattered. So, if you're listening to this, and you've been underestimated, disrespected, discarded by someone who never saw your worth, don't chase revenge. Build your life in silence. Let your presence unravel their illusion. Let your peace become your power. And when the time is right, walk away, not to prove anything, but because you no longer need to. And that is the final victory.